The girl asked me about the gate before I had finished writing down the previous reading, which is the only reason I remember the order of things, because if she had asked me 10 seconds later, I would have been walking already and I would have answered her without stopping, and we would not be where we are now, which is sitting in the car at the bottom of Old Foundry Lane, with the handheld switched off and the engine off, and the windows down because she said she felt sick. She is 16. She is on half-term. She asked to come on the round because her father is in Reading until Friday, and she did not want to be in the house on her own, and I said yes, because the round is 6 hours of walking, and she has been quiet for 3 weeks in a way that I have not been able to ask about directly. I thought the walking would do it. I thought somewhere between Bramford Road and the industrial estate she would tell me what was wrong with her, or she would not. But at least we would have walked together, and that would be something I could put down later as having tried. I have been a meter reader for the regional utility for 11 years. I read electricity and gas, mostly residential, some small commercial. The route I walk on Tuesdays covers 263 properties across a band of streets that runs from the train station up to the edge of the old Foundry estate. I have walked it for so long that I do not need the printed sheet anymore. The handheld tells me where to go. It loads the route in sequence at 6 in the morning, and it bleeps softly when I have stood at the correct address for long enough to be considered present. It pairs with the meters over a short-range signal. Most newer meters transmit automatically. The older ones I read manually, by lifting a cover and writing the figures into the handheld with a stylus. I am supposed to take a photograph of any meter I read manually. I am supposed to log any meter I cannot access. I am supposed to flag any meter that gives a reading more than 15% outside the seasonal average. I am supposed to never enter a property uninvited, even an unlocked one, even one that is clearly disused. I am supposed to mark the address as a no read and move on. I am supposed to do these things, and I do these things. And after 11 years of doing these things, I do them without thinking, which is the part I want to write down before I forget it, because I think the not thinking is what she saw. We started at 6:40. The first 30 addresses on the route are flats above the parade of shops on Bramford Road. I did them quickly. She stood on the pavement and looked at her phone. At the first stop, I showed her the handheld and explained how it worked, and she nodded the way. Teenagers nod, which is to say she had already understood it in about a third of the time I had spent explaining. She is good with that kind of thing. She is good with most kinds of things, and has been since she was small, which is the part that has made the last 3 weeks difficult, because something has happened, and she has not told me, and I have had to walk around her in our own kitchen, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been moved overnight. By 9 we were on the residential streets behind the church. She had started walking ahead, then dropping back, then walking ahead again. At one point she asked me what happened if a house did not have anyone living in it, and I said you mark it as a no read and you move on. And she said, but the meter is still running. And I said yes, but the reading still goes in, and the bill still goes out to wherever the bill is meant to go. She said, to who? I said, to the registered occupant. She said, what if there isn't one? I said, then to the owner. She said, what if there isn't one of those either? I said, then it sits on the system until someone notices. She said, who notices? I said, eventually somebody. She did not say anything for a while after that. We stopped for tea at the petrol station at 10:30. She bought a packet of crisps and ate them in the car. I asked her if she was all right, and she said yes, the way she has been saying yes for 3 weeks. I did not push. I never push. That is the rule I have with her, and have had with her since she was 11, which is that I will ask once and accept the first answer, and she will tell me later if she wants to, and most of the time she does, and the time she does not, I have learned to live with. I started the car. We drove the 4 minutes to the start of the second half of the route, which begins at the bottom of Old Foundry Lane and works up the hill to the edge of the estate. Old Foundry Lane is a long curved residential road of detached houses set back from the pavement behind low brick walls and hedges of varying enthusiasm. There are 41 properties on it. I know them. I have known them for 11 years. Number 2 is the house with the magnolia. Number 10 is the house where the dog used to bark at me and now does not, because the dog died last spring, and the woman who owned it told me about it at the door in March, and I said I was sorry, and she said thank you, and we both stood there for a moment because there was nothing else to say. Number 26 is the bungalow with the camper van in the side return. Number 40 is a converted coach house at the top. I could draw the road from memory. I have, in fact, drawn it from memory once for a training assessment 3 years ago. I got every property right. We were walking up the odd-numbered side. The handheld was running through the readings in sequence. She had taken to standing at the gates while I went up the paths, which I did not mind, because most of the meters on Old Foundry are external boxes mounted on the front wall of the houses, and I did not need her at the box with me. The morning had warmed up. The hedges smelled of the wet from the night before. There was a cat on a windowsill at number 33 that watched us both with the kind of patient, unblinking attention that cats give to people they have decided are not interesting. We did 33. We did 35. We did 37. At 37, the man came out to ask me whether the rates were going up again, and I said I didn't know. I only read the meters, and he said yes. Of course, sorry, and went back inside. We walked on. The handheld bleeped. The next address loaded on the screen. The screen said number 38B, Old Foundry Lane. I walked past my daughter, who was standing at the gate of 39, and I went a few paces back, because 38B was a subaddress I read every quarter, and the gate for 38B was between 37 and 39, on the left, where there was a narrow tarmac drive running back between the two hedges to a small detached property set behind them. I went up the drive. I read the meter. It is an old box on the side wall, and the cover is stiff, and the figure had moved from the previous quarter by about the amount I would have expected for a small household over autumn. I wrote the figure into the handheld with the stylus. I photographed the meter. I closed the cover. I walked back down the drive to the road. The handheld bleeped to confirm that the reading was logged, and the next address loaded, which was number 39, where my daughter was already standing at the gate looking at me. She said, "Where did you just go?" I said, 38B. She said, "Where?" I said, "There." I pointed at the drive between the hedges. She said, "Mum, there isn't a drive there." I looked at the drive. The drive was there. It was a narrow tarmac drive about 4 meters wide running back between two privet hedges to a small house that I could see clearly from the road. A single-story property with a gray slate roof and a white front door and a pebbled forecourt. The number 38B was on a small ceramic plaque on the left-hand gatepost. I had just walked up that drive. My boots had wet on them from the grass at the edge of it. The handheld in my hand had a photograph of the meter I had read 60 seconds previously, time-stamped, geotagged with the meter serial in the metadata. I said, "Of course there is." She said, "No, there isn't." She was not arguing. She was telling me. She said it the way she used to tell me there was no monster under the bed, which was that she had checked, and she was reporting back. I walked her over to the drive. I said, "Look," I said, "there's the gate, there's the plaque, there's the house." She said yes. She could see the gate, and she could see the plaque, and she could see the hedges, and she could see the drive going back between them, she said. "But there isn't a house, there is just hedge. The drive goes about 2 meters in, and then it stops, and there is hedge, and behind the hedge is the back garden of number 37, which you can see from the road if you stand back a bit, and that is the end of it." I looked at the drive. I saw the drive. I saw the house at the end of it. I saw the white door. I could see from where we were standing the corner of a downpipe on the left-hand side of the house where it met the gutter. She said, "Mum, are you all right?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Give me a second." I said, "Hold this." I gave her the handheld. I walked up the drive again. I walked 4 paces, then 6, then I put my hand out, and my hand went into a privet hedge that was wet from the morning, and I had a moment when my hand was in the hedge, and I was looking past my hand at the door of a house that I could see was 3 more paces away, and my hand was in the hedge, and I could not bring the two things into the same picture. I stood there. I took my hand out of the hedge. I looked at my hand. There were small wet leaves stuck to my knuckles. I looked at the door of the house. The door was still there. I could see the brass numbers on it, 38B. I walked backwards out of the drive. I did not turn round. I walked backwards until I was on the pavement next to my daughter. She was holding the handheld out towards me with both hands the way you hold something hot, she said. Mum, what just happened? I said. I'm not sure, she said. You put your hand into the hedge, and you stood there. You stood there for a long time, I said. How long? She said. About a minute. I took the handheld back. The screen had reverted to the next address, which was 39. I scrolled back to the previous entry, 38B, the reading I had just taken, the photograph I had just taken, the timestamp, the meter serial, the geotag, which read as a point on the map between 37 and 39, set back from the road by approximately 20 meters. I scrolled back further, the previous quarter, 38B, a reading, a photograph, a timestamp. The photograph was of a meter inside a stiff plastic cover on the side wall of a single-story property. White pebble dash, gray slate roof. I scrolled back further. The quarter before that. The reading I took in March, the day the woman at number 10 told me her dog had died. The reading I took in December, in the cold with my fingers numb. The reading I took the previous September. The reading I took in summer of the year before. Every quarter, going back, as far as I could scroll on the handheld, which is 2 years of history, before the device archives older readings to the central server. I have read this meter every quarter for 11 years. I know I have, because I have read every meter on this route every quarter for 11 years, and I have not missed any of them, because the route does not let you miss any of them. The handheld will not move on until it has logged the reading. If there is no signal, you write it manually. If there is no access, you flag a no read. There is no fourth option. There is no address on the route that goes unread for 11 years. My daughter was looking at me. I said, "Can you see the plaque?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Can you see the drive?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Can you see the gateposts?" She said, "Yes." I said, "The hedges?" She said, "Yes." I said, "But you can't see the house." She said, "No." She said, "Mum, there isn't a house there. I'm sorry. There just isn't." I sat down on the low brick wall of number 37. I put the handheld on my knees. I looked at my boots. There was wet grass on my boots from the edge of the drive, which she could see, and a small flat green leaf stuck to the toe of my left boot, which she could also see, and I lifted my boots up so that she could see it, and she said, "Yes, Mum, I can see the leaf. The leaf is real. The drive is real. The plaque is real. There just isn't a house at the end of it," she said. "Has there ever been one?" I said, "I don't know." "I have read this meter every quarter for 11 years, she said. "What does the meter look like?" I said, "It's an old box on the side wall, with a stiff plastic cover, the kind with a hinge at the top, and inside there's a dial reading and a serial number on a brass plate, and the cover sticks a bit because the hinge is old," she said. "Can I see the photograph?" I gave her the handheld. She zoomed in on the photograph I had taken 8 minutes earlier. She looked at it for a long time. She said, "This is a real meter," she said. "Mum, this looks like a real meter on a real wall," I said. "I know," she said, "but there isn't a wall." We sat there for a while. The cat on the windowsill at number 33 was still watching us. The man at number 37 had gone back inside and shut his door. The road was empty. It was 11:20 in the morning on a Tuesday, at the end of October, and we were sitting on the wall of a house we did not live, in looking at a drive that led nowhere, with a handheld between us that contained 11 years of evidence that I had walked up that drive 4 times. She said, "What do we do?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "We should call someone." I said, "Who?" She said, "The company." I said, "And tell them what?" She said, "Tell them there's an address on your route that doesn't exist." I said, "I read the meter 8 minutes ago." She said, "No, you didn't." She said it gently. She said it the way she used to correct me when I got the names of her school friends wrong, which is to say, she said it without any edge in her voice, because she was telling me what she had seen, and she had seen me stand at the entrance to a drive that ended in hedge, and put my hand into the hedge, and stand there with my hand in the hedge for a minute, and then write something into the handheld, and take a photograph of nothing. I looked at the handheld. The photograph was of a meter. I could see the meter. I could see the brass plate. I could see the small chip in the corner of the cover, where I had caught it with my stylus 3 years ago and never reported because it wasn't really damage, just a chip. I scrolled back to the photograph from the previous quarter, the same meter, the same chip, the same brass plate, the same wall. She said, "Can you scroll further back?" I said, "Only 2 years on this device. The older ones are on the server." She said, "Can you get them?" I said, "Only from the office." She said, "Can we go to the office?" I said, "The office is in Colchester." She said, "Can we go to Colchester?" I said, "After the round." She said, "Mum." I said, "I have to finish the round." She said, "Mum, no you don't." I said, "I do. Because if I don't finish the round, it goes into a misread pool, and someone else has to come back tomorrow and pick it up, and they'll wonder why I stopped at 38. And they'll ask me why I stopped at 38. And I'll have to tell them, and I don't want to tell them yet." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I don't know what I'd tell them." She said, "You'd tell them what happened." I said, "What happened?" She said, "You read a meter at a house that isn't there." I said, "That's not what happened." She said, "It is. That's exactly what happened." I said, "I read the meter. The meter is there. I have a photograph of the meter. The reading is in the system. The address is on the route. I have been reading this meter every quarter for 11 years. The meter is there. You can't see it, but the meter is there." I heard myself say it. I heard the order of the sentences. I had said the meter is there 3 times in increasing volume. And the last time I said it, I was looking at my daughter, and she had taken a small step back from the wall. I stopped talking. She said, "Mum." I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "It's okay." I said, "It's not." We sat there for another minute. I put the handheld down on the wall beside me, screen down. I put my hands on my knees. I looked at the drive. The drive was still there. The plaque was still there. The hedges were still there. The house was still there. I said, "Can you walk up the drive with me?" She said, "Yes." We stood up. We walked over to the entrance of the drive. She went first. She walked 4 paces. She put her hand up. Her hand went into the hedge. She kept her hand in the hedge, and she turned and looked at me. I walked up to where she was standing. I put my hand up. My hand went into the hedge, next to hers. The hedge was a privet hedge, dense and wet, and my hand went into it up to the wrist, and our 2 hands were in the hedge together, and beyond our hands I could see the door of the house, which was 3 paces away, and the brass numbers on it, 38B. She said, "You see the hedge?" I said, "I see the hedge edge." "You see your hand?" I said, "I see my hand." She said, "What else do you see?" I said, "The door of the house." She said, "Where?" I said, 3 paces ahead. She said, "Mum, your hand is in the hedge. The hedge is right here. The door isn't 3 paces ahead, because the hedge is, and you can feel that." I could feel that. I could feel the wet leaves of the hedge against the back of my hand. I could feel the small woody resistance of the privet stems. I could feel a spider's web break across my knuckles. I could also see, past my hand, the door of the house, 3 paces ahead, with the brass numbers on it. She said, "Close your eyes." I closed my eyes. She said, "What do you feel?" I said, "Hedge." She said, "Where is your hand?" I said, "In the hedge." She said, "Where is the house?" I said, 3 paces ahead. She said, "Open your eyes." I opened my eyes. The house was 3 paces ahead. She said, "Mum, the house isn't there. You feel that it isn't there. You just told me it isn't there. But you can see it." I said, "Yes." She said, "When did you start seeing it?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Was it always there?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "The first time you came up this drive, was the house there?" I said, "I don't remember the first time I came up this drive." She said, 11 years ago." I said, "I don't remember." She said, "Try." I tried. I tried to remember the first time I had read the meter at 38B. I have a good memory for the route. I remember the first time I read most of the addresses on it, because the first time at any new address is a small event. You stand at the gate, and you check the number, and you work out where the meter is, and do you note any access issues. I remember the first time I read number 2 with the magnolia, because the woman who lived there then had been pruning the magnolia and apologized for the path being slippery with cut wood. I remember the first time I read number 10, the doghouse, because the dog had been a puppy then and had jumped up at me. I remember the first time I read number 40 at the top, the coach house, because the man who lived there had given me a glass of water because it had been a hot August. I remember almost every first time. I do not remember the first time I read 38b. I tried to remember the second time. I do not remember the second time. I tried to remember any time. I remember walking up the drive. I remember the stiff cover on the meter box. I remember writing the reading into the handheld. I remember the small chip in the corner of the cover. I do not remember any first time. I do not remember any conversation with anyone who lived there. I do not remember a face at a window. I do not remember a name on a letter at the door. I do not remember a car on the pebbles. I do not remember a doorbell, a knocker, a security camera, a wheelie bin, a milk bottle, a doormat, a number plate, a coat, a child, a parcel, a builder, a postman, a dog, a cat, a satellite dish, a chimney pot, a curtain, a light on, a light off, a noise from inside. I have read this meter 44 times. I have stood 3 paces from that door 44 times. I have never seen a person at that house. I said this to her. I said it quietly. I said, I have never seen a person at this house. She said, Mum. I said, I know. She said, we need to go. I said, where? She said, I don't know. Home. The office. Anywhere. We need to get off this drive, I said. All right. We walked backwards down the drive. We walked backwards because I did not want to turn my back on the house, which I am writing down, because I want to be honest about what I did. We walked backwards onto the pavement. I picked up the handheld from the wall of number 37. I switched it off. The screen went black. I put it in the bag. She said, Are you supposed to switch it off in the middle of the route? I said, No. She said, What happens? I said, It gets logged. She said, What gets logged? I said that I switched it off. We walked back down Old Foundry Lane to the car. We did not run. We walked at a normal pace because there was nothing visibly chasing us and because I did not want to look like a woman running away from a hedge. We got into the car. I put the handheld bag on the back seat. I put the keys in the ignition. I did not turn the engine on. We sat there, she said. Mum. Was that real? I said. Which part? She said. You read a meter at a house that isn't there. You took a photograph of a meter that isn't there. There are 11 years of readings on the system for a meter that isn't there. Was that real? I said. The readings are real. She said. That's not what I asked. I said. I know. She said, What is at that address? I said, I don't know. She said, What was the meter for? I said, Electricity, she said. Who was using the electricity? I said, I don't know. She said, The meter was reading. It moved between quarters. You said it had moved by the amount you would expect for a small household over autumn. I said, Yes. She said, So something was using the electricity. I said, Yes. She said, But there isn't a house. I said, No. She said, So what was using the electricity? I did not answer that. I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, and I looked at my hands. I had a small green leaf stuck to the cuff of my coat where I had put my hand, into the hedge. I picked it off. I held it between my fingers. It was a real leaf. Privet, slightly waxy, smelling faintly of the morning, she said. Mum, I said. I'm thinking. She said, Can I say something? I said, Yes. She said, I don't think you should go back to that road tomorrow. I said, I'm not on that road tomorrow. I'm on the industrial estate tomorrow. I'm on Old Foundry next quarter, she said. I don't think you should go back to that road next quarter, I said. All right, she said. You said it that fast. I said, What? She said. You said all right that fast. You didn't think about it. You normally think about things like that, I said. I know. She said, Why didn't you think about it? I said, Because I think I have been thinking about it for 11 years without knowing. She looked at me. She was sitting in the passenger seat with her knees up against the glove compartment, the way she has sat since she was 12. She had a small smear of dirt on her left cheekbone from when she had brushed her hair back with her hedge hand. She looked at me for a long time. She said, What does that mean? I said, I don't know yet. I turned the engine on. We drove out of Old Foundry Lane onto the main road. I drove past the church. I drove past the petrol station. I drove past the parade of shops. I did not drive towards home. I drove towards the A12 turnoff. She watched me do it and did not say anything for about 2 minutes. She said, Are we going to Colchester? I said, Yes, she said, to the office. I said, Yes. She said, Why? I said, Because I want to see the older readings. I want to see the original record for 38B. I want to see when it was created. I want to see who put it on the route, she said. Won't they ask why you stopped the round? I said, Yes. She said, What will you tell them? I said, the truth. She said, which is? I said, I don't know yet. We drove. It is 40 minutes to Colchester on the A12. She did not look at her phone. She looked out of the window. After about 10 minutes, she said, Mum, can I ask you something else? And I said yes. And she said, the procedure, the handheld. You said it will not move on until you have logged the reading. You said if there is no access, you flag a no read. You said if there is no signal, you write it manually. You said there is no fourth option. I said yes. She said, what would the handheld have done if you had said no read at 38B? I said, it would have logged it as a no read and moved on. She said, would it have flagged anything? I said, it would have flagged the address for the next round. She said, has 38B ever been flagged? I said, I don't know. I would have to check the office record. She said, in 11 years, have you ever flagged 38B as a no read? I said, no. She said, in 11 years, have you ever marked it as anything other than read? I said, no. She said, why not? I said, because I read it every quarter. She said, why did you read it every quarter? I said, because it was on the route. She said, who put it on the route? I said, the route is generated centrally. It comes from the meter registry. If there is a meter at an address with an active account, it goes on the route, and the reader walks past it once a quarter and reads it, she said. So there is an active account at 38B. I said, there must be. She said, in whose name? I said, the handheld doesn't show account holders. Only addresses, she said, but the office does. I said, the office does. She said, can you look it up? I said, I can look it up. She said, will you look it up? I said, yes. She said, today. I said, yes. She said, all right. She put her hand on my arm while I was driving, which she has not done since she was about 13. She left it there for a moment and then took it away. I want to write down what happened at the office, because what happened at the office is the part I want to remember exactly, because the next time I think about whether what I am doing now is the right thing to do, I will want to be able to read back what they said and what I said and what we decided. The office is in a business park on the north side of Colchester. I have been there 6 times in 11 years. The duty supervisor on a Tuesday afternoon is a woman called Hannah, who is 43, and who has known me for most of the time I have worked there, and who is, more importantly, a person who notices when something is wrong, which is a rarer quality in supervisors than people generally credit. I sat down at a terminal in the back office and I logged in. My daughter sat in the chair next to me with her coat on her lap. I queried the address. 38B Old Foundry Lane. The screen brought up the record. I want to be precise here. The record showed an active electricity account. The meter serial matched the meter I had photographed that morning. The account had been opened in March 1987, 3 years before I was born. There had been 4 account holders over the life of the account. The current account holder was listed under a name I will not write down here because I do not know what writing it down would do. The name was mine. It was my full name with my maiden name, which I have not used since 2003. The billing address was my home address. The opening date for me as account holder was the 6th of March 2003, which is the date I got married. The account had been paid quarterly by direct debit out of an account in my maiden name. The account in my maiden name was an account I had closed in 2004 when I changed banks. According to the record on the screen, that account had continued to pay the electricity bill at 38B Old Foundry Lane every quarter for the subsequent 22 years. The total billed over those 22 years was approximately £1,490. I sat at the terminal and I read the screen 3 times to be sure. My daughter was reading it over my shoulder. She said, Mum, is that you? I said, yes. She said, why is it you? I said, I don't know. She said, did you open this account? I said, no. She said, are you sure? Said, yes. She said, Mum, are you sure? I said, yes. I would have remembered. You don't open an electricity account at a house you don't live in, she said. But the bank account paid it, I said. The bank account was closed in 2004. She said, but it paid. I said, I know. She said, how? I said, I don't know. We sat there. I did not call Hannah over. I did not call anyone over. I read the screen again, the total billed, the meter serial, the opening date, the name, the maiden name. I want to write down what I felt, because I am not sure I will feel it the same way again once I have decided what to do. I did not feel afraid. I felt the way you feel when you turn over a stone and find that the soil underneath is a different color than you expected it to be. I felt curious in a very still way. I felt that something had been happening for a long time, longer than my marriage, longer than my daughter, longer than me, and that I had walked into the middle of it on a Tuesday morning at the age of 38, with my 16-year-old standing at a gate asking me a question that nobody else had ever thought to ask. I thought, somebody set this up before I was born. I thought, somebody put my name on it the day I got married. I thought, somebody used my closed bank account to pay it for 22 years. I thought, I walked up that drive 44 times. I thought, I did not see the house until I had been doing the job long enough that the handheld had taught me to see it. I thought all of this in about the time it took my daughter to take her coat off her lap and put it on the back of her chair, which is to say in about 3 seconds, she said. Mum, I said yes, she said. What are you going to do? I said, I am going to close the account. She said, can you do that? I said, I am the account holder. I can do that, she said. What happens if you close the account? I said, the supply is disconnected. She said, to what? I said, to whatever is using the electricity at 38B Old Foundry Lane. She said, Mum. I said, yes, she said. Do you know what is using the electricity at 38B Old Foundry Lane? I said, no. She said, are you going to find out? I said, no. She said, are you sure? I said, yes. She said, why? I said, because I do not want to know. I have been being trained for 11 years to know it without knowing it. I have been being paid to know it without knowing it. Somebody has been paying me out of my own closed bank account, in my own maiden name, to walk up that drive 44 times and put my hand into a hedge and write down a reading from a meter I cannot really have, read and walk away from a house I cannot really have seen, and I have done it 44 times without asking the question that my 16-year-old daughter asked in the first 10 seconds of standing at the gate. And I think that if I find out what is at the end of that drive, I will be the kind of person who knows it, and I will not be the kind of person who can walk away from it. And I would like very much to be the kind of person who can walk away from it. She looked at me. She said, all right. I said, all right. I opened the account closure form on the terminal. I filled it in. Account holder request. Effective immediately. Reason no longer required. Final reading. The reading I had taken that morning. Final billing address. My home address. Confirmation of identity. My staff number. My date of birth. My mother's maiden name. The 3 security questions I had set on the account in 2003 without remembering setting them, which the system accepted on the first attempt for all 3. I submitted the form. The screen processed for about 4 seconds. The screen returned. Account closed. Supply disconnection scheduled. Within 2 working hours, I logged out of the terminal. We walked out of the back office and through the main floor and out through the reception, and Hannah saw us and waved, and I waved back, and she said, all right, and I said, fine, just popped in to query a record, and she said, all right, see you Thursday, and I said, see you Thursday, and we walked out into the car park. We sat in the car. My daughter put her seatbelt on. She said, what now? I said, we go home. She said, are you all right? I said, I think so. She said, are you going to tell Dad? I said, yes. She said, all of it. I said, yes. She said, will he believe you? I said, you will be there. She said, yes. She said, Mum. I said, yes. She said, the next person who walks that round. I said, yes. She said, what happens to them? I said, the address has been removed from the active register. The next time the route generates, 38B will not be on it. The next reader will walk from 37 to 39 without stopping. Whatever was being paid for is not being paid for anymore, she said. Will they notice the drive? I said. I don't know, she said. Will they notice the plaque? I said. I don't know, she said. Will they put their hand in the hedge? I said. Only if someone is with them who hasn't been doing the job for 11 years. She did not say anything to that. We drove home. We drove past the church and past the petrol station and past the parade of shops, and we did not turn into Old Foundry Lane. We went home. My husband got back from Reading on Friday, and we told him on Friday evening, in the kitchen, with the handheld between us on the table, and he did not say a great deal, because there was not a great deal to say, but he held my hand for a while, and then he held our daughter's hand for a while, and then we had dinner. I am writing this down on the Sunday. I am writing it down because my daughter asked me to. She said, "Mum, you should write it down, because if you don't write it down, you will start to talk yourself out of it." And I think she is right, because already, 2 evenings later, sitting at the kitchen table with the handheld switched off in the bag by the door, I have caught myself thinking 3 times that perhaps I was tired, that perhaps the light on the road that morning was strange, that perhaps the house was there, and my daughter simply could not see it because she was not the one trained to see it. And each of those 3 times I have made myself stop and look at her, sitting opposite me, doing her homework with a small smear of biro on her cheek, and remind myself that she was the one who told me my hand was in the hedge and she was right. The route runs again next quarter. I will not be on it. I have asked to be moved to a different round, and the supervisor has agreed, and I will start on the industrial estate route in January. The reader who picks up Old Foundry Lane will be a man called Daniel, who has been with the company for 2 years. He is good. He will not stop between 37 and 39. The handheld will not bleep there. The drive will be there. The plaque will be there. The hedges will be there. He will walk past them. I am almost sure of this. The bank account in my maiden name. I rang the bank on Friday morning. The bank said the account was closed in 2004 and showed no activity since. I asked them to check the last 22 years for any direct debit to the utility, and they said there had been none because the account had been closed, and a closed account cannot pay a direct debit. I said yes, of course, and I thanked them, and I hung up. The utilities record shows 22 years of paid quarterly bills. The bank's record shows a closed account. Both records are real. They are on different systems. Both systems are correct. The money was paid. The money was not paid. The meter ran. The house was not there. The drive is there. The plaque is there. My daughter put her hand in the hedge, and I put my hand in the hedge, and our hands were in the hedge. Together and beyond our hands there was a door I could see, and she could not. She asked me last night, before she went to bed, whether I thought it would happen again. I said, "What?" She said, "The not seeing." She said, "You said you had been being trained to see it." She said, "Do you think you have been being trained by other things to see other things on other rounds for other reasons?" She said, "Do you think there are other addresses like that one on your route that you have been reading for 11 years without seeing them properly?" She said, "Mum, do you think you would know?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "That's all right." She said, "I'll come on the next round with you." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I want to." I said, "All right." She said, "I'll tell you what I see." I said, "All right." She said, "And you tell me what you see." I said, "All right." She said, "And if they're different, we'll stop." I said, "All right." She kissed me on the forehead and went up to bed. I sat at the table for a while. I looked at the handheld in its bag by the door. I did not switch it on. I am not going to switch it on until Thursday morning at 6, when the new route loads, and I will walk the industrial estate with my daughter beside me. On the half-term Friday, she is asked to take off school, and we will see what we both see, and we will see what only one of us sees, and we will stop when we need to stop. The supply at 38B was disconnected on Tuesday at 1:23 in the afternoon, which I know because the system sent me a confirmation email, which I have kept, and which I will keep, and which I will show to my daughter when she is older, and asks me again what happened on the Tuesday of her October half-term, when she was 16, and I will say, "This is what happened," and she will say, "Yes, I remember," and we will both be telling the truth, and we will both have the same memory of it. And that will be the part that matters.